Welcome back. I am John P. Today, we're going to be talking about 5 watches that you should avoid. Now, I'm not going to be saying anything really negative about specific watches, with a couple of small exceptions, but more so, I'm going to be sharing with you watches that certain types of collectors might not want to have in their collection and what the reasoning is behind them. I think there are a lot of people that are attracted to watches. There's a lot of different types of people that have begun to collect watches and wear watches, and I think that's really cool and interesting. But with that comes a lot of people that might be beginners, or maybe they haven't watched videos like this. So I really do hope that this video does help, because I receive questions like this on my Instagram, The Real John P, all of the time. So I try to make videos like this to share with people. Now, if you're someone that's been around for a long time and you're really not looking for advice, I can't blame you, but let's keep in mind that many people are new to watches, or they like to hear about certain subtleties and intricacies and the nuances of different watches. So I'm going to be sharing this with you, and please do not forget to check out delraywatch.com, where we probably have many of these watches I'm about to tell you to avoid. So the first watch that you should avoid, and I'll tell you why, please hang with me, is vintage watches. Now, many of you that watch this channel are going to know right away that basically my entire watch collection is vintage watches. So let me backpedal and explain. Why should you avoid vintage watches? Now, not everyone should avoid vintage watches, so I'm not talking to everyone. But if perhaps you're newer to watches, or you want watches that are going to be carefree, you might want to avoid vintage watches. With vintage watches, and I know this because I've been collecting vintage watches throughout the entirety of my collecting and now my watch dealing career, I love vintage watches. They're unique, they're special, they offer so much more charm and history behind them than you can ever find in modern watches. But with these things, and with these watches that are collectibles, really antiques, come certain nuances. One of those things is the watches take extra care, right? We're talking about things that are old. They've been exposed to weathering, erosion. I know they're not sitting outside for the most part, but the reality is the stressors of the world have been bearing down on this thing for maybe a century, depending on the watch. So, of course, it's not going to function probably like a modern watch would. With this comes extra servicing, shorter servicing intervals. You might have to hunt for parts. When the watchmaker says, hey, I can't find this part for your Value 72 chronograph, for example. You might have to help them, depending who your watchmaker is. Not Hans at Delray Watch, because we do a pretty great job by that, but sometimes even we have to hunt for the parts, and that's part of the fun, in my opinion, of vintage watches. But much like a vintage car or an antique car, these things are going to break down. The engineering standards today are much different than in the past, and once again, all of these forces of life and the world have been bearing down on this item. So that's one of the things. The other thing that I think really shocks people is the bracelets with vintage watches. The bracelets have been pulled apart and worn through decades and decades of use. And even the watches that really haven't been used a whole lot, the standards of the bracelet creation and the methods and the ways that they create bracelets back then, decades ago, was just different than today. So when people are not sure about vintage, sometimes I see them get into it and they're a little bit disappointed, because you put a brand new Rolex or something or an AP on your wrist, it's going to feel a lot different than one from a few decades ago. So something to keep in mind. But if you can look past this, I love vintage. Once again, almost my entire personal collection of watches is vintage. So not for everyone, it's for me. Maybe it's for you. Leave it in the comments below. Next, you should avoid, much like the reasoning behind vintage watches, but the same type of person or collector perhaps should avoid complicated watches such as a perpetual calendar and all the other higher end complications. With complications come complications, get it, in servicing the watches. I know, a little bit silly there, but the watches are more complicated, so they're more difficult to maintain. There's more pieces generally, or parts in the mechanics, for things to go wrong. And also, because it's more complicated, it's just not fitting to use for everyday life for many people, right? Think of slapping a Rolex Submariner on your wrist. and then going out and literally doing anything and it's going to survive. Now, imagine slapping up, I don't know, an Audemars Piguet perpetual calendar on your wrist. Well, there's all these extra parts and it's a little bit more delicate, and the mechanics and the engineering that it took to actually make these things work introduce additional fault points. We're talking about mechanical items, things that move. So when you get more complicated, these watches have more potential for failure. But if you like the complications, go for it. Many people love watches because of the intricacies, because of the complications, because of what humans have been able to do and the craftsmanship behind the watches. I love it. Would I recommend wearing a perpetual calendar every day? No. But then again, if you don't, you're probably going to have to set the watch. And that's another thing to consider, is when you get into some complications, they have these little things that you have to do, right? So something to keep in mind, if you want a stress-free and a worry-free wear of a watch for an everyday wear, a complicated watch is probably not your number one choice, and you should avoid it. But then again, it's your opinion. Do whatever you'd like, really. At the end of the day, it's your choice. But next we have older dive watches. I see so many people get into an older dive watch and they want to go diving with it, or they want to go swimming with it. They want to get a watch that's 50 years old and hop into the ocean. Now, it's possible a good watchmaker, Hans or literally anyone else, or the Rolex Service Center, you name it. If you have a watchmaker, use them. We're actually pretty backed up on our service at Del Rey with the inventory that we have. But I see people wanting to get sports watches from decades ago, or even a decade ago, and hop in the water. And generally, you're just asking for trouble. Now, the older the watch is, once again, circling back to vintage, the older the watch is, the more likelihood that something could go wrong. Even if you have the watch pressure tested, it could change in the future, right? You can get dust, dirt, grime, whatever, debris when you're screwing down the crown, and maybe it doesn't close all the way. Maybe the threads on the tube are not there, or the crown, and the way that you screw it down, and the threads kind of loosen up over time depending on the watch, wear down. We're talking about, once again, life pushing down on the watch and changing the way that it is from the original intent of the watch. So older dive watches, I would avoid them for diving. If you actually want to dive, or you want to go in the water, you want to swim or shower with your watch, please look at a modern watch for that. Now, I'm not saying this is going to happen for everyone. There's going to be many people in the comments that will say, hey, John, I've been wearing my Submariner since 1980, and I haven't taken it off a day in my life, and everything is fine. Yes, that's true. It happens all the time. But we also do see the horror stories where, someone gets all this water damage and it's rusty. They put it in their drawer. They bring it out 10 years later, and you have to throw the whole thing away, or, take it out for parts. And we do see this. So it's not a surefire thing, but I would just avoid it. Err on the side of caution. We're talking about luxury items that come at price points. Why not avoid it and save yourself the hassle? Your choice at the end of the day. And with kind of the Rolex theme, I would avoid the Oyster Quartz. I think it's cool. I think it's very interesting. I think it reminds us of a time where these big manufacturers, big, I mean in popularity, in terms of popularity and prestige, you think of the Patek Philippe's, think of, let's talk about the Beta 21 movements. Let's talk about a time where you had these quartz watches, the quartz crisis, and all of these manufacturers thought they were going to have to go quartz. Rolex came out with the Oyster Quartz. It worked. It's cool. It's nice. Has that integrated bracelet looking kind of like a Genta or almost a Royal Oak in that stratosphere. So people like it. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a decades old quartz watch, and a watch that was never really that popular. And so with that comes, unfortunately, a little bit of service nightmares. Now, you could send it to Rolex. I'm sure they'd help you out. But Rolex, I've done videos on this where they've kind of phasing out servicing of the vintage watches in favor of just being able to keep up with servicing of their modern watches and the demand there. And so I have heard and seen horror stories about people that have had Oyster Quartz watches. Usually it's dealer friends that have unfortunately end up kind of just taking losses on the Oyster Quartz that they took a gamble on. But when we talk about things like bracelet parts or case parts or movement parts, it's just a nightmare. There's a few watchmakers out there that say that they can, resolder, the board and things like that on the inside, but it's just a nightmare. So unless you absolutely love the Oyster Quartz watch, and there's some people that do and are willing to take the risk, I would generally advise maybe not getting this watch if you can learn to love or live with another Rolex watch or something else out there. What do you think, Oyster Quartz? Leave that in the comments below. And lastly, something I mentioned in a lot of my videos, but I would avoid purchasing a watch you don't like. Because I buy, sell, and trade watches, Del Rey watch, and even before Del Rey watch, when I was just kind of doing it privately, I would oftentimes see people that would buy a watch because it was hot, buy a watch because it just came out, some limited edition, you know what I mean, who's coming out with all these limited edition watches that people are really banging on the doors for. But people buy these watches and they think they're gonna love it, and they just don't. So they had other motivations, they had other driving factors that pushed them into getting this watch, and it just didn't work for them. And when they go to sell the watch, it doesn't fare very well. There's not that many people that get into a Rolex and say, I hate it, gotta get rid of it. Generally, people keep the watch if you compare how many are floating around to how many get traded. But when it comes to some of the other brands, people get it because maybe it's the hot thing or the hot dial color, a green dial at the time, and then they get it, not for them, not the right case size. The brand image just didn't click with them. And so I always recommend avoiding buying the hot watch unless you love it, and avoid buying the watch that everyone else has or the watch that someone says you should get. Someone on YouTube perhaps says you need to buy this watch. Unless you like it, don't buy it, right? There's flippers, there's speculators, there's people that want to make a quick turn, collectors out there that say, hey, I'll buy this watch and I'll sell it for a little bit more. Not always the case when it comes down to it at the end of the day. So I always recommend to buy the watches that you like, and you'll always be happy. What do you guys think about this? Do you have any other watches that you personally would love to avoid going into the future, or maybe you have in the past? I'd love to see it. Hear it, comments below. Don't forget to check me out on Instagram, The Real John P, as well as find us at delreywatch.com, where we have plenty of watches that I don't think you should avoid, but we'll leave that up to you. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.